has been today. All right, I'm going to bottom line it right away. Here is the, I guess, the big headline out of today's unexpected Friday news dump of Mitt Romney's 2011 tax returns. Here's the big headline. Mitt Romney says that Mitt Romney is not qualified to be president. I mean, this has been a weird week. There have been a lot of fast-moving developments in the presidential campaign, but I do not think anybody could have predicted that the week was going to end like this. You may remember back in July, during Mr. Romney's big overseas trip to Europe and the Middle East, Mr. Romney sat down with ABC News, and he spoke with them in part about his tax returns. He talked with them about why we, the people, have not been allowed to see many of his tax returns, despite the fact that he's been going around the country telling everybody a lot of things about what's in those tax returns. He says he's paid all of his taxes. We have to trust him on that. We have to take his word for it, but we're not going to be allowed to see the evidence. Here's what he told ABC News at the time.
I have paid all the taxes required by law. I don't pay more than are legally due. And frankly, if I had paid more than are legally due, I don't think I'd be qualified to become president.
If I had paid more taxes than are legally due, I don't think I'd be qualified to become president. Nobody who pays $1 more in taxes than they legally owe is qualified to run for president. It's a weird assertion, right? I mean, it's a weird assertion, particularly for Mr. Romney, because his own father, when he ran for president in 1968, made it public knowledge that as a rich man, he had declined to take certain tax deductions that he was legally allowed to take. So was Mitt Romney saying that his own father was not qualified to be president because he paid some more taxes than he had to? It was a weird thing to assert when he said it in July. But it was made all the more weird today. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, so late on a Friday of what has been the single worst week of his entire presidential campaign, Mr. Romney finally released 1 year of his tax returns, his long-awaited, long-promised 2011 tax returns. In the return, we learned that zillionaire Mitt Romney paid an effective tax rate last year of 14.1%, which is probably lower than you. But that is actually a higher tax rate than he could have paid legally. Here's how the Romney campaign explains it. Quote, the Romneys donated $4 million to charity in 2011. But, as you can see here, the Romneys claimed a deduction of only $2.25 million for those charitable contributions. So they donated $4 million, but they only deducted $2 million. They could have deducted all $4 million. In other words, Mitt Romney, in 2011, paid more in taxes than was legally due.
If I had paid more than are legally due, I don't think I'd be qualified to become president.
Ta-da! Why would the Romney campaign put their candidate in the position of declaring himself unqualified to be president? Because last month, Mitt Romney declared to the country in another interview that he had never paid less than 13% in taxes at any point over the last 10 years. He had always paid more than 13%, he said. And even though he said that, turns out mathematically that was not going to be true in his taxes for this past year, for 2011. So in order to make that statement from last month retroactively true, Mr. Romney's accountants went back and artificially inflated his tax rate so it would comport with what he said. They artificially inflated his tax rate to more than it legally needed to be. So his previous statement about what he paid in taxes wouldn't be a lie. And in so doing, Mitt Romney unwittingly declared himself unqualified to be president of the United States. This is nuts. This is nuts. If he had simply filed normally, taking the deductions he is legally entitled to make, he would have paid a lower tax rate than what he paid. But since that would have been a political problem, purely for show, he deliberately overpaid the IRS in order to purposely increase his tax rate on purpose. And he explained that's why he was doing it. As Steve Bannon put it at Mattoblog today, he said Mr. Romney was in the rather extraordinary position of selecting his own preferred tax rate and then working backwards from there. This whole thing is a mess for the Romney campaign, and maybe it was going to be anyway, but now we know exactly what kind of mess it is. In these new tax returns, we learned that Mr. Romney made $13 million in total income last year. And aside from the gee whiz factor of him making $13 million a year, even though he hasn't had an actual paying job since 1999, aside from that, there is also the fact that even other millionaires, average millionaires in this country, pay way more in taxes than Mitt Romney pays. The average effective tax rate for your run-of-the-mill millionaire in America right now is 25%. That's what the average millionaire in America ends up paying in taxes after all the things they do to their taxes. But Mitt Romney is a special kind of millionaire. He doesn't pay 25%, he only pays 14.1%. How do you get 10 points below the rate that even the other millionaires are paying? You get that by trying. You get that by working really hard at avoiding taxes. As the Wall Street Journal noted in combing through today's returns, quote, the Romney's main tax return mentions entities based in the Cayman Islands on at least 28 separate pages. The Romney campaign is insisting that those Cayman Islands investments have nothing at all to do with avoiding taxes. Maybe his money just likes a nice view. But honestly, everything that we know about Mr. Romney's financial history points to his involvement in decades and decades and decades of one tax avoidance scheme after another. This house on Gentle Bend Drive in Missouri City, Texas, Mitt Romney owns that house. Every month, the couple who lives in that house makes out a personal check to Mitt Romney for $600. They don't have their mortgage on that house through a bank. Their mortgage is with Mitt Romney personally. Why is Mitt Romney this one Texas couple's mortgage lender? Oh, because of a tax avoidance scheme that he got involved in back in the 80s that he's still in on. They refied with him this year. When Mitt Romney sat on the board of the Marriott Corporation, Marriott took advantage of a bunch of fancy auditing tricks called son of boss. After Mitt Romney's tenure on the board's audit committee, Marriott ultimately got slapped with tens of millions of dollars in fines from the federal government. And that's because son of boss was a criminal tax avoidance scheme. A tax avoidance scheme was also at the center of Mr. Romney's run for governor of Massachusetts in 2002. Even though Mr. Romney told Massachusetts voters he had always filed his taxes as a Massachusetts resident, Mr. Romney actually had declared his primary residence in Utah, in what the local paper there described as an attempt at, say it with me now, tax avoidance. Mr. Romney's Olympic dressage horse, Rafelka, not just a hobby for his wife, also a tax avoidance scheme, an attempted $77,000 write-off on his tax returns. Mr. Romney's first release of his tax returns earlier this year showed investments not just in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda, but also in Switzerland, a Swiss bank account, where money can also have a very nice view and can be shielded from American taxes. Mitt Romney's entire adult life has essentially been one long, boring plot to dodge taxes at one level or another. That's what rich people do, certain kinds of rich people, right? And that's what makes the specifics of his tax returns so exotic and therefore so interesting. That's why people want to see his actual returns for multiple years. They don't necessarily just want to take his word for it. Well, today Mr. Romney released 1 year's tax return, but the other years, still holding back. Today they released a summary of 20 years worth of taxes. They're not releasing the tax returns from these years. They're not even releasing specific details. They're just releasing a summary of what tax rate he paid over 20 years. Mr. Romney has had to release summaries of his financial situation in the past. If you're running for federal office, you have to release personal financial disclosure forms. Mitt Romney had to do that, this year. Rick Santorum, Rick Perry, all these guys had to do that. And Mitt Romney, over the years, in those disclosures, has hidden stuff that could have potentially been damning to him. And we don't know much about it because he's never released much of the actual tax returns for us to compare them with. But when he has released tax returns we can compare with those summaries, the comparison does not look good. Here's an example of what I mean. When Mr. Romney released his tax returns for 2010, that's the year that we had before today, he had already made summary disclosures about his finances for that year, that same year, in order to run for office. He'd already filed these personal financial disclosures. But then we got the actual tax returns, and you could compare them to those summaries for that same year. And it turns out that in the tax returns were listed 20 different investment vehicles that were just never listed in his disclosures, including 7 of the 20 that were overseas foreign investment vehicles. Commenting on why all the juicy foreign stuff had been hidden in his disclosure forms until it had to come out in the tax return, Mr. Romney's campaign spokeswoman Andrea Saul said at the time that the candidate's failure to include his Swiss bank account in earlier financial disclosures was merely a, quote, trivial, inadvertent issue. Trivial and inadvertent. Today, after months of stalling, Mr. Romney finally released the one additional year of tax returns that he says the American public deserves to see. His vice presidential nominee, Paul Ryan, was required to give him 10 years of tax returns for Mr. Romney to review, but we are only allowed to see 2 years from Mr. Romney. What we learned in the year that he released today is that, obviously, Mitt Romney is a zillionaire who has dedicated lots of time and energy to avoiding taxes over the years. I mean, 28 pages in the current return discussing investments in the Caymans. But the timing on this is just incredible. I mean, I understand the campaign's thinking in terms of getting all the bad stuff out at once. Well, we're having a bad day anyway. How much worse can it get? It can get worse. Honestly, it's a little bit crazy in terms of political strategy here. In the same week that we get the new fresh evidence of Mitt Romney's lifelong, enthusiastic, lusty pursuit of avoiding taxes, we also get to see how Mr. Romney talks about the issue of taxes behind closed doors, when he thinks he's only talking to his fellow zillionaire Republicans. While we get to see the enthusiasm with which he runs from the opportunity to pay taxes, we also learn what he thinks about the 47% of Americans who are not required to pay federal income taxes, who he says see themselves as victims and who can't be convinced to take personal responsibility or care for their lives. And while Mr. Romney is happy working full-time to lower his tax burden, other people paying low taxes disgusts him.
47% of the people who vote for the president no matter what. All right, there are 47% who are with him. These are people who pay no income tax. 47% of Americans pay no income tax.
I think it's a real problem when you have half of Americans that are, almost half of Americans that are not paying income tax.
That's the real problem. The rest of the country is not paying enough. It's time for everybody else to do their part. Chris Hayes joins us in just a moment. But first,